Okay, we'll start with this per tweet from Lance Pugmire. Illuminating talk with Stephan Espinoza today, Stephan Espinoza of Showtime. He confirms he raised the financial stakes to beat out Fox for the Canelo Alvarez versus Caleb Plant fight. And I was assured earlier in the day, PBC will still be working with Fox in 2022. When that news broke, that the Canelo Alvarez versus Caleb Plant fight wasn't going to be shown as a Fox pay-per-view, was initially interpreted as Fox parting ways with the PBC, potentially making the decision not to renew, even though they have the option to extend the deal one more year.
At least.
Because when they first reached the deal, it was a 4-year deal. And we were only 3 years into it. Obviously, the pandemic had its role to play in all of this.
It did.
But Fox was very much invested in the career of Errol Spence Jr. I think that goes without saying. And Errol,
It's been 2 years.
It's been 2 years since the Sean Portier fight. And the subsequent 2 years that followed, Errol Spence Jr. wasn't able to deliver them big numbers. For obvious reasons. After the Porter fight, he had that car accident. He sat out for a year. He comes back. He fights Danny Garcia. The numbers aren't nothing to write home about.
He doesn't fight for most of the year.
But they managed to land him a Manny Pacquiao fight, and due to an injury that he suffered in preparation for that fight, he doesn't get to have it.
Detached retina.
Reports indicated that Errol Spence Jr. might sit out upwards of 6 months to a year, though Errol Spence Jr., by way of his social media, very recently posted a video that shows the eyes all healed up.
Well, he still didn't get to have the fight.
Thus, he didn't get to bring in Fox any big numbers the entirety of 2021, and it's looking a lot like he might sit out the entire year, perhaps return early next year. Ugas stood in his place. Ugas fought Manny Pacquiao. Ugas beat Manny Pacquiao. And big win that might have been for Yordenis Ugas as far as pay-per-view buys. It didn't bring in big numbers.
Nothing has lately.
The Fox pay-per-view for Wilder vs. Fury 2 brought in better numbers than the Showtime pay-per-view of Wilder vs. Fury, the first fight. The second fight outperformed the first fight, but the second fight didn't break even because it was a more expensive fight to put together than the first fight was. In the first fight, the sum total of guaranteed purses to the fighters didn't come out to roughly $60 million the way the second fight did. Thus, the operational costs for the second fight were harder to cover.
Wilder vs. Fury 2 on Fox was a flop.
It was a joint pay-per-view between Fox and ESPN, though all the same. It failed to break even. People lost money.
That was pre-pandemic.
Post-pandemic, they've been slugging along, and nothing that they've put on has really brought in big viewership, big numbers. Though based on this tweet, it looks like Fox hasn't parted ways with the PBC just yet. There was a scenario that I entertained in my previous video.
There was reason enough to believe they were parting ways.
Abysmal and dismal viewership, rumors from industry insiders that Fox is unhappy, and
the Canelo versus Plant fight ended up on Showtime instead of Fox.
According to Stephan Espinoza, it's because he fought vehemently and aggressively to get it. He upped the ante, he upped the stakes, and Fox decided to pass on it. Fox decided to walk away. And Fox is a bigger network than Showtime. It reaches many more homes than Showtime does. But Fox has already got Wilder vs. Fury 3 to think about.
They didn't make any money off the second one, so they're hoping they can do that with the third.
They just staged the Manny Pacquiao versus Yordenis Ugas pay-per-view, and it didn't bring in astronomical numbers. Thus, here, towards the end of the year, close to it, perhaps now is not the best time to make a $50 million commitment to a Canelo fight, a Canelo pay-per-view, Canelo being the face of boxing in this country. Perhaps now is not the best time to attach themselves to that fight because of what else they have going on and what they've had going on. Thus, the fight ends up on Showtime. They passed on Canelo Alvarez versus Caleb Plant. They're not even involved in the Crawford versus Porter fight. That's not a co-promotion. Top Rank is helming the promotion for that thing, Top Rank and ESPN.
There was reason enough to believe they would jump and ship.
Enough cause for concern, but in a separate scenario that I entertained here on the channel, I warned that we shouldn't be presumptuous with this news that Canelo versus Plant is going to Showtime instead of Fox, because it could just be that Fox doesn't want to do that fight in particular, given its price tag, what else they have going on, and what else they've had going on. That perhaps they're not parting ways with the PBC just yet.
Maybe not.
They just don't want to do that fight because of the operational costs tacked onto it. If Stefan Espinoza did in fact raise the stakes, he created a very expensive situation that maybe Fox don't want to deal with right now. So what can we expect from Fox moving forward in 2022 when Fox didn't roll out a big schedule the same way that Showtime did?
I mean, they had a couple of fights.
In the year of 2021, one or two here and there. The year of 2021, they will have shown one or two Fox PBC pay-per-views, but nothing in keeping with what Showtime rolled out, what Showtime unveiled when they announced their big schedule for what remains of 2021.
Fox didn't roll out a big schedule this year.
So what can we expect them to do in 2022? Well, there are one or two fighters out there that are in need of a fight date. Keith Thurman, that guy needs a tune-up fight. Gary Russell Jr. was very recently ordered to fight Mark Mixayo, his mandatory challenger. The WBA very recently ordered Yordenis Ugas to participate in a 4-man tournament. If the story checks out and Fox is staying in bed with the PBC going into 22, maybe you see the return of Keith Thurman, maybe you see the return of Gary Russell Jr., maybe you see the winner of Kovnowski versus Helenius 2, maybe you see that guy, whoever it is. Should Canelo Alvarez beat Caleb Plant? We don't know that he won't have an extended stay on PBC's Isolation Island. If by some chance he does, maybe you see Canelo versus Charlo as a Fox PBC pay-per-view.
The 4-man WBA welterweight tournament.
Danny Garcia's debut as a junior middleweight. Danny Garcia, who hasn't fought the entirety of 2021. He's been sat out since 2020 when he lost that decision to Errol Spence Jr. Maybe you see that guy. I can think of one or two characters we might see in the year of 22 if, in fact, PBC has not parted ways with Fox and this story checks out. So we'll see what develops as a result of this news. In other news, Caleb Plant reacted to yesterday's melee via social media by saying, "You'll never hear me talk about someone's mother, kids, or wife. When men go off to war, they leave the women and children at home."
Canelo said that he got mad Caleb talked about his mother.
Caleb disagrees. He said, "No way y'all believe that shit. Truth is, he's mad he's got someone in front of him who isn't scared of him and isn't just here to pick up a check. And his ego can't handle it." The animosity between these two guys, it seems genuine enough, as does the cut under Caleb Plant's right eye, the cut that he suffered as a result of the melee. My previous video, we talked about how everything Caleb Plant's been saying in the buildup of this fight, mouthing off as much as he's been mouthing off, it will help to create, I should say, a harsher environment for him inside of those ropes, inside the squared circle. One subscriber here on the channel added,
"So are they supposed to fight Canelo without pissing him off? Do you even know how fanboyish this sounds?"
And supposed to doesn't come into it. It's a simple case of causality. What you're doing is going to produce a result.
So mark my words, November 6th, you will hear the words, "and the new undisputed super middleweight." The only difference is right after that, you'll hear the words, "and still undefeated." Mark my words. That's funny? You think that's funny? A little bit. Yeah?
What you're doing is going to result in some kind of outcome.
Cause and effect.
Causality. Fighters like Daniel Jacobs, Callum Smith, they were nowhere near as mouthy to Canelo Alvarez as, say, Billy Joe Saunders was. And comparatively,
They finished the fight.
they went the distance. Canelo Alvarez did not exhibit the animosity towards them that he exhibited towards, say, Billy Joe Saunders, who is being mouthy the way that Caleb Plant's being mouthy, though I will say Caleb Plant is being even mouthier.
Well, keep laughing. You keep laughing, motherfucker, because you know when you're going to find out? Real soon. And you know when you're going to find out? The same time everybody else found out. And you know when that was? You know when they found out? When it was too late.
And looky, Canelo drew blood.
First blood. We're over a month away from the fight, and already they're coming to blows.
It's causality.
You're saying what you're saying, for whatever reason you're saying it, and you're entitled to say it. It's your God-given right, and it's a free country.
But it's not without repercussions.
Nothing is. It's not without its consequences and its end result. Causality.
Maybe you think Canelo's a drug cheat.
You know the only difference between you and him is he's a fat-ass bitch and you a bitch. What the fuck you gonna do? Fuck you. And you a drug cheat.
Maybe you think the Eddie Reynoso gym, the entire gym, is full of dirty fighters, and maybe you have reason enough to feel that way. When you actually say it, however...
You bitch. And you a bitch too. You know the only difference between you and him is he's a fat ass bitch and you a bitch. What the fuck you gonna do? Fuck you. And you a drug cheat.
That's something else entirely.
No such thing as a free lunch.
You can do that. Nobody's going to stop you, though when you do that, it does change things. Yeah, Canelo Alvarez may not have the same demeanor towards you that he might have had towards Daniel Jacobs or Callum Smith, who are a little bit more respectful.
So tell me something. Oscar Valdez can pop positive for something and not get suspended for 6 months, but he can pop positive for something and get suspended for 6 months. But somehow
don't make excuses before the fight.
Cheater.
Don't make excuses before the fight.
Didn't get as personal with Canelo Alvarez ahead of their fights with him as you're getting ahead of your fight with him.
You're making it personal.
Because you're making it personal. You're going to make Canelo Alvarez more aggressive, give him that much more incentive to make a statement against you than he would have if you kept things kosher, kept things cordial, kept things professional.
Just causality is what it is.
You want to go shooting off at the mouth? Shoot off at the mouth.
You got suspended for 6 months.
Say whatever you say.
Fuck you.
See you November 6th.
Suck my dick.
You can do that, but if you shoot off at the mouth, you're going to give Canelo Alvarez that much more incentive to close
To
it.
shut you up.
And that's what I'm pointing out. I think the fight fans thoroughly enjoyed yesterday's commotion. I think it was beneficial towards the fight's overall profile. It helped to galvanize the fight fans in the way that they weren't already galvanized in reference to the fight.
It got people excited.
People were buzzing about it afterwards on every social media platform you can think of. Facebook, Twitter, YouTube, Instagram. It was all over the place. You couldn't get away from it. And that's the benefit. I mean, that's what makes it beneficial. That's the pro, as it were, and the pros and cons. The cons, however, the con for Caleb Plant, at least in this situation, is remember, you're the one that's going to have to fight him.
And that's just an observation.
I'm not even advocating that he stop doing what he's doing. I like it. I enjoy it. Even if it means he's going to get his ass kicked worse.
I'm just pointing that out.
You're already caught between a rock and a hard place, and what you're doing, you're poking the bear. If that's what you want to do, then do it. Though if it gets you hurt, if it gets you hype, it just is what it is.
You want to see something special on you and feel.
You gonna find out.
It's causality. Finally, Sean Portier had this to say ahead of his upcoming title fight with Terrence Crawford, his old buddy, in November. He says, "I'm not the PBC fighter that Terrence Crawford wanted to fight." Porter says Crawford didn't want to fight him. He said, what's he supposed to say? Just like I wouldn't answer a question about strategy and what he does well and what he does bad, said Sean Porter to KO Artist Sports when told that Crawford is looking forward to getting a chance to beat a PBC fighter finally. Crawford, can say he's looking forward to beating a PBC fighter, and he can say he's looking forward to getting in the ring with a PBC fighter. But we both know I'm not the PBC fighter he wanted to get in the ring with. And that's not even talking about Errol Spence Jr., so there's that, said Porter about Crawford. I think this is the best fight for me right now, said Porter. I think to date, it's the best fight for me to date. And I think that he's going to present some things in the ring that nobody else has and vice versa, which makes this such a good fight. I don't think that Sean Porter was the fighter, the PBC fighter that Terrence Crawford wanted to face initially, but a lot has happened over time. A lot has changed.
Think about it.
Initially, it was Errol Spence Jr. that Terrence Crawford was after, and it wasn't for no reason. It was because Errol Spence Jr. was a champion, and that was the hottest fight in the welterweight division.
Back then.
A lot has happened since then, and that fight has cooled off. Errol Spence Jr. more recently has been incapacitated, at least for the foreseeable future, with a detached retina. Keith Thurman has been out of action since the Pacquiao fight. That was roughly 2 years ago. I don't think Terrence Crawford ever took Keith Thurman seriously.
I don't think most people did.
Back when Keith Thurman got everybody all excited when he was supposedly campaigning for a Crawford fight, telling Bob and Bud to send a contract, I never bought into that spiel. I never bought into that narrative because Keith Thurman was coming right off a loss and surgery and inactivity.
No way he fights Crawford under those circumstances.
Not unless Uncle Bob and the people at Top Rank promise him 8 figures up front, 8 figures guaranteed to do the fight. At that time, the audiences were limited. The audiences weren't even all the way back yet.
8 figures without live gate revenue.
Not that Keith Thurman is an 8-figure fighter, because he isn't, not by himself. He needs a dance partner. He needs a Manny Pacquiao to garner that kind of attention. So you got Keith Thurman, who you really can't take seriously. Incapacitated Errol, who was incapacitated after 2019, after the car accident. He comes back briefly, fights Danny Garcia, finds himself being incapacitated again this year. You got inactive Keith, incapacitated Errol, unwilling Danny. Danny rather try his luck at junior middleweight than see about having a fight with Terrence Crawford. And it's not like they didn't offer Danny the fight before. They did.
Years ago.
Not even telling you that Sean is off base when he says that he's not the welterweight that Crawford wanted to fight. Perhaps not in the beginning, but a lot has happened, a lot has changed. I mean, even Bob Arum changed his demeanor towards the fight, where before he was wondering who's going to put up the money for such a fight. At that time, here today, he's the one putting up the money for that
He
fight.
changed his mind.
Because the situation changed. Here today in 2021, this is the premier welterweight fight.
2021 it is.
This could very well be the most titillating fight, the most titillating matchup, the most exciting fight the welterweight division has to offer up in the year of 2021.
Maybe Sean wasn't Terrence Crawford's first choice.
Perhaps not, but enough has changed and enough has happened that he was left with no choice. No choice for more reasons than one. No choice because the WBO ordered that fight. No choice because, well, Keith's still inactive, Errol's incapacitated, Danny's moving up in weight.
It's not like Sean has all that many options either.
It really doesn't. I mean, Spence is incapacitated, though even if he weren't, I doubt he'd give Sean a rematch. I don't think anybody wants to see an Ugas versus Porter rematch. Not that Ugas is available to have it. He's under direct orders from the WBA to participate in a 4-man tournament. Spence ain't available. Ugas ain't available. Nobody wants to see Porter versus Danny Garcia 2. Nobody wants to see Porter versus Thurman 2. I mean, it sounds a lot like Sean is saying that Terrence Crawford used him as a last resort, but the same is true in reverse. Sean's already been in there with everyone else, from Kell Brook to Adrian Broner to Keith Thurman to Danny Garcia to Yordenis Ugas to Errol Spence Jr. So perhaps Terrence Crawford did view Sean as a last resort, but the same is true in reverse. It looks a lot like Sean viewed Terrence as a last resort as well.
I think they're both genuinely excited to fight each other.
To have the spotlight in the welterweight division put on them for a change. They're not just background characters in someone else's story. They are coming to the forefront with what is 2021's premier welterweight fight. Premier welterweight contest. The one fight at 147 pounds that mostly everybody's excited about.